Chapter 18. Valuable Clue. "Kidnapped!" Nancy fairly shrieked. "Oh no! When? How?" "I don't know." Hannah Gruen's voice was shaky. "Please come right home. I phoned your father's office, but Miss Hanson said he's in court and can't be disturbed." "I'll come as fast as I can get there," Nancy promised. When she relayed the message to Bess and George, they were horrified and dashed out to the car with her. All the way to the Drew home, Bess kept murmuring, "Poor Carol." And George said, "I'm sure those awful Jemmets did it and will hold her for ransom." Nancy remained silent. Conflicting ideas raced through her mind. She tried to convince herself that Carol had left of her own accord and would either telephone or return soon. When Nancy reached the house, this bright thought was dashed. Hannah Gruen was pacing the floor. "I went to the store for a short time and left Carol here," the housekeeper explained. "She promised to keep the doors and windows locked and to let no one in. Oh, what shall we do?" George suggested notifying the police, but Nancy said, "Let's wait until my father comes. He should be home soon. Hannah, why are you so sure Carol was kidnapped?" "Because the laundryman came here right after I got home. When I told him what I suspected, he said he'd seen a car pull out of our driveway with a young girl in it just as he arrived." "Who was with her?" "A couple. From the man's description, I suppose it was the Jemmets. Where do you think they took her?" "I wish I knew," Nancy replied, terribly worried herself. She decided to take George's advice and call Police Chief McGinnis. He was alarmed at the turn of events. "So far, no police have found any trace of the Jemmets," he said. "It's possible they're in hiding somewhere. In any case, if there's no word by tomorrow, I'll notify the FBI. In the meantime, there may be a ransom note. Nancy, I think I should warn you about getting into the same predicament yourself. After all, the Jemmets no doubt consider you their most formidable enemy." "One thing puzzles me," Nancy said. "The Jemmets were remembered in the will. Why are they acting like this?" "Probably to coerce your friend into signing a paper promising them a large portion of her inheritance for taking care of her. They may even get her signature on a letter begging the Fernwood orphanage to let the Jemmets remain as her foster parents." "She'll never do it," Nancy told the chief. "Under a threat, she may." Nancy was not convinced, but Hannah, Bess, and George were. The cousins felt that their parents should know what had happened and telephoned them. The Fanes and Marvins promised to help all they could and then came to pick up their daughters. Mr. Drew arrived soon afterward and was as disturbed as the others by the kidnapping. He notified the orphanage of Carol's disappearance and of their suspicions. None of them ate much dinner, each lost in thought. Finally, Nancy said, "Dad, what are the visiting hours at the jails?" "They're not all the same, dear." "Why?" "I'd like to talk to Krill. Maybe I can get him to reveal where the Jemmets are hiding." "Not a bad idea," the lawyer said. "If nothing breaks by tomorrow morning, I'll go with you to Maywood." Although no telephone messages or callers came during the night, Hannah and the Drews slept poorly, and they were up early. Mr. Drew telephoned the jail and found that in his case an exception would be made to the rule of afternoon visitors only. He and his daughter could come at 10. As Nancy was about to go for her car, the telephone rang and she rushed to answer it. An unfamiliar voice, speaking with a foreign accent, said, "Is this Nancy Drew?" "Yes." "I called to warn you not try find Carol Wipple, or both of you be harmed." The stranger hung up. Hannah had been standing close enough to hear the message. She turned to Mr. Drew. "Please don't let Nancy out of your sight. Someone has just threatened her." "I shan't," he said. The Drews rode quickly to the Maywood jail and were taken to Krill's cell. The prisoner was defiant. "I said I ain't talking," he greeted them. "To the police, perhaps. But how about just to us?" Mr. Drew suggested. "Huh! And have you blab it to them? No, sir." Krill turned his back on the callers. Nancy was convinced this man could not be wheedled into giving information about the Jemmets. She used another method. "Mr. Krill, there's been a kidnapping and you're involved," she said. The prisoner did an about face and yelled, "I am not! I told Frank I wouldn't have any part of it." Suddenly he stared at Nancy. "Who was kidnapped? You are supposed to be the one." Mr. Drew spoke up. "Things will go a lot easier with you, Krill, if you tell everything you know." The prisoner walked up and down nervously. "I needed money. Frank Jemmett said he knew an easy way to get it, and that would square him with me. I'd done him a big favor. In return, he'd pay me well to get Nancy Drew off the case and try to find some papers hidden in the tower room by the man who died. He told me where the ladder was. When you drove in, Miss Drew, I thought up the scheme to fool and drug you. But I couldn't take you along with me because your boyfriend was around. I knew Jemmett would be mad because he told me to bring you to—" "Yes?" Nancy said. Krill walked back and forth several times before replying. At last he said, "I may as well tell you. The Jemmets own a little cottage along a branch of the Muskoka River. I don't know exactly where it is, but they said it was sort of in a woods at the end of a road called something like Student. They called the cottage Restview, I think." Just then a guard came to say, "Time's up, Mr. Drew." Nancy was thrilled by what they had learned. "Dad, can you go there with me right away?" she asked as soon as they were outside. "I wouldn't miss the chance," he smiled. Looking for a road with a name like Student that ran to a branch of the Muskoka proved to be frustrating. After 2 hours of fruitless searching, Nancy and her father stopped for lunch at a roadside restaurant. They discussed where to go next. Presently, they became aware of a woman at the next table who seemed to be interested in their conversation. Finally, she leaned over and said, "Perhaps I can be of some help. Do you think the road you're looking for could be Steuben? There is such a road about a mile from here. It leads directly to the water." "Oh, thank you," said Nancy. "We'll try it." To the Drews' delight, Steuben Road led directly to Restview Cottage. There were no other houses around. No car was in sight, and the place appeared to be deserted. "I guess the Jemmets aren't using this," Mr. Drew remarked. "But they may have left Carol here," Nancy said. "We must find out." She and her father stepped from their car and knocked on the door. There was no answer, and not a sound inside or outside the cottage. "Carol may be tied and gagged," Nancy said. "We must make sure she isn't in there." "I agree." Mr. Drew was grim. They walked around the building and began looking in the windows. No one was in sight. Suddenly, Nancy grabbed her father's arm and pointed into the living room. "See those boxes along the wall? They're just like the ones Frank Jemmett was taking out of the tenant house at Asa Sidney's. And they're marked like the cartons I saw in the warehouse yard. I'm sure they contain stolen property." "You're probably right," the lawyer agreed. "We have no right to break in, of course. I guess we'd better—" He stopped speaking as they heard a car coming. Nancy and her father braced themselves. Were they going to come face to face with the Jemmets, and perhaps Carol? In a few seconds, they saw the approaching sedan was not that of the Jemmets, but a police car. The driver was a state trooper, who said he was on a routine checkup of all roads in the vicinity. "You're just the man we need," Mr. Drew told him and showed his business card. "This is my daughter Nancy." "I've heard of you both," the trooper said. "My name's Hatch. What can I do for you?" "Tell him, Nancy." After hearing the story, Trooper Hatch said, "We mustn't lose any time. I'll force a window and we'll go in." The three climbed into the living room. First they looked for Carol and called her name several times. She was not there. Nancy was disappointed. Now the search would have to be continued. But where? "Let's examine these boxes," Mr. Drew suggested. Nancy and the two men began to untie them. She had chosen a heavy cardboard box with many perforations in the top. Nancy knelt on one knee, pulled off the lid, then shrieked in terror. End of chapter 18.